The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseWare continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseWare at ocw.mit.edu.
Okay, yes, so he has said light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history at the end of Origin of Species. So this is a note that reflects, as we know, Darwin's desire in the Origin of Species not to get into the complex questions of humans. Because humans are so embedded in culture and complex self-reference that to get into that kind of a discussion when he's really trying to make the, in some sense, deeper and more profound point of the origin of life forms, would just be a needless distraction. And so he stayed quite clear of it. So how did Darwin form his views of humans, and where did he get his, what were the elements of his experience that that may have fed into his thinking? And certainly of of primary importance was his great voyage, the voyage of the Beagle. Because on this voyage, he gathered incredible amounts of information, all sort of summarized and organized and given a narrative in his Journal of Researches, or Voyage of the Beagle, as it's popularly called. And in that work, he has many comments on humans. He was fascinated with the people that he encountered. And you know, he's a 19th century Englishman, so he's not used to seeing people in nature in other cultures. So yeah, he was pretty floored. And you can see it in his language. I could not have believed how wide was the difference between savage and civilized man. It is greater than between a wild and domesticated animal, inasmuch as in man there is a greater power of improvement. How does that strike you? Comment. Yeah, Claire.
I was kind of wondering like what his position was looking at different races and like, because he was talking at one point, I think about the ability to twitch your skin on your skull, and he said like people of darker skin seem to have even more of an ability to do that than than white people. And yeah, I don't know, that he made some comments about like Negroes, and I didn't know what his position was there, whether he like sees us as one species back then, or if he's like I don't know.
Is he a racist? Is Darwin a racist?
That's
I mean, this is a discussed question.
Yeah.
But certainly, as far as humans and the different races of humans as distinct species, definitely not. I mean, you know, this is, I mean, it's a much larger book than we had a chance to read fully for this one class that we have on it. But there's an extensive discussion on race. And yeah, his...
is there like a chapter?
His the main chapter, which he goes through all the issues, is chapter 4, I think it is. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, chapter 7.
Oh yeah, on the racism.
Yeah, so he has a whole discussion there on race, and I'll say a few things about it as we go along here. But you can see in the language that He is, he's amazed. I mean, this is not something he expected to see. People in a natural environment who were really less developed than what he was familiar with from his British upbringing. And so he has many passages in the Voyage of the Beagle where he sort of speculates and describes these various people. And this other section here, in another harbor, not far distant, a woman who was suckling a recently born child came one day alongside the vessel and remained there out of mere curiosity, whilst the sleet fell and thawed on her naked bosom and on the skin of her naked baby. These poor wretches were stunted in their growth, their hideous faces bedaubed with white paint, their skins filthy and greasy, their hair entangled. This isn't what we would expect of somebody who was familiar with these scenes. So obviously this is very surprising. And their gestures violent. Viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are fellow creatures, inhabitants of the same world. Yeah, Devin.
I want to slap Darwin across the face with this kind of thing. It's just like,
Yeah.
I mean, I think understandable for his time period, but really, man, you gotta get it together because what's the name of this particular group? How do you pronounce that?
Fuegians.
Yeah. So I was doing a little background reading on them, and apparently they've got a creationist story involving hummingbirds and the notions of that. And you know what? The important thing about those people is that they have language and they have culture.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that at least with the creation story, they can point to a god as it's flying around as opposed to pointing to the sky. So it's a little frustrating. And I think here Darwin begins to show some of his weaknesses in his indoctrination of traditional Western philosophy. But I think it would be hard for anyone in that time period to kind of.
I think you're right. There are a lot of things here. Darwin is just not into that space and experience of sort of understanding, the context. I mean, he sees these people as kind of, mammals, just like the way he looks at the rest of the natural world, and so he's astonished at the difference. But you would have to say this was probably, pretty much expected of this time. I mean, people were not used to encountering each other, and Darwin, in some ways, had the ability to really understand what he was looking at, a difference that was pretty amazing. And this is, of course, the young Darwin just kind of out there into the world, and suddenly seeing these things are just kind of overwhelming. So I think in some sense it reflects a deeper understanding of what he's looking at than many people might have of his time been able to bring. So he could really. So, but if you look at the Martins, these are paintings that watercolors that Conrad Martins did. If you look closely, this guy, he's got quite a bit there. He's got a hut. He's got a fire in front of it. He's got a dugout. He's got spears. He's got, if you look closely, he's got a pipe and tobacco. He's got clothes.
But monkeys can have tobacco.
Well, that's. But you can see they're actually a fairly complex set of tools, and a fairly extensive kit, if you will, for getting food and for protecting himself. So when you reflect on this a bit, there's a lot that's being revealed here that reflects cultural acquisitions of considerable extent. So it was a big surprise to Darwin. But I think Darwin, to his credit, also absorbed these materials, and as he writes his Descent of Man, this experience becomes much more integrated into his general system of looking at things. And he is, well, we'll see a few more things. So what's happening at this period are a lot of different things, as I've mentioned in some of the past classes. There was a lot of quarrying going on for the building of for buildings and all kinds of other types of structures, bridges, things of that sort, because of the development of the time. 1800s, early 1800s in England were the country was expanding rapidly. The growth was considerable. Railways were being built, cities were rising, and so a lot of this led to extensive quarrying for the raw materials, mining, stone making, and this all led to all kinds of discoveries. And in a limestone quarry site in the valley of Neander, the Neanderthal remains were discovered in the summer of 1856. This was just one of several such events, and people began to discover these remnants of various types of human remains. And one of the works that was written at the time by T.H. Huxley was titled Man's Place in Nature. And in this work, he went through the discovery of these human remains, and he made arguments in which he argued that these really were part of the same ancestral tree of humans, that they were just more, they were forms affiliated, associated with humans back in time. Humans had branched off from common ancestors, and that these remains showed that humans had connections in the natural world and in the past. There were a number of other discoveries, as I mentioned, the Angus skull in Belgium, and there were discoveries in Gibraltar, and so people began to, a lot of scientists, especially morphologists and comparative anatomists, began to appreciate that these remains really were of humanoid forms that were extinct, were no longer in existence, but that had been in existence in the past. So these were illustrations from Huxley's Man's Place in Nature. They're a little provocative, but other people like Charles Lyell, who you remember from The Geologist, he wrote a very important book, a big book. I actually gave you a link to it. I don't know if you have some time. When you get some time, you can go poke around in some of these works. This book, The Antiquity of Man, was published in 1863. It was a very substantial work, just dealing with findings of and remains of humans from the various types of objects that have been found geologically, to be mixed in with various layers of ancient geology. And of course, Lyell was very interested in studying, the strata of things. He was interested in, he studied the size of lakes, and he had a whole concept of the change and flux of climate leading to changes in lake levels and land levels, and his concept of the world was really a sense of one of massive areas in constant flux. And in that flux, many things of the past could be found in various types of places, layers and strata. So here's one case in his Antiquity of Man, in which he talks about low levels on Lake Zurich in 1854. So again, a few years before Darwin's origin, in which a number of different sites had been exposed, and they found these old Neolithic village implements and so forth that showed, whole communities of people had lived here, and these people lived in a different context. Lyell, being the orderly individual he is, came up with a kind of a language for trying to characterize some of these different periods, including the Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic, and then the Neolithic, and then the Bronze Age. And these became large categories for thinking about stages in which humans must have existed. And that Fuegian that Darwin was looking at was, not a Bronze Age. That was not a Bronze Age culture. It was more a Neolithic, New Stone Age tools, specialized tools, but not advanced metal technologies and things of that sort. Other thinkers of the day were expanding in the realm of anthropology. People were actually being studied, and it was becoming much more. This was a growing field in Darwin's time. Edward Tyler was just one person. There were many other anthropologists, and he published a work called Primitive Culture in 1871. This is the same year as Darwin's Origin, in which he pretty much argued that all people have culture. I mean, and all cultures are, in some sense, modern, in the sense that they're all of the current time. And he also argued that there were certain persistent behaviors and trends throughout all cultures, and he definitely had a comparativist approach to culture and mythology. Just he could see that all different cultures had some kind of mythology that they at the center, and in some sense his own included. That there was a mythology associated with Christianity. He pretty much took a approach consistent with what Darwin takes in the Descent of Man, that culture is adaptive. Having a culture is a big advantage. What are some of the advantages of having a culture? Jake.
Excuse me. Obviously, support of all the people around you. You're not on your own. You don't have to. I mean, this is kind of not the greatest example, but like if you break your foot, I can't go hunting, but I can rely on my neighbor to say, "Can you buy me some food?" Whereas if it's way back when it was just like hunter-gatherer, you break your foot, well, now you're someone else's food.
Yeah. Okay. You get to avoid becoming part of the food chain. Yeah. No. That's certainly. I mean, at a fundamental level, the value of social networks is incredible. Yeah.
It also allows to pass down more than just physical traits. You can pass down traditions, methods of doing things.
Yeah. These traditions, so you can pass down adaptation that takes place outside of the body. Organisms pass down through reproduction, whatever the content of their being, so to speak. Whereas humans have ways of getting outside of that and passing down adaptability, things that adapt them to their. So that Fuegian, who has a spear, probably didn't invent that technology. Almost certainly didn't. But he knows how to use it because he got it from his culture. So that's a very powerful force. Yeah.
Education.
Education, absolutely. The ability to pass down very complex concepts and sets of ideas that you can begin to make use of that Aristotelian discipline as you begin to accumulate a body of knowledge. You can pass that down, and people can become possessors of it through education. Tyler was really, he sort of naturalized, he and his colleagues and other people of his time, like I said, he wasn't working alone, but he's a representative, a very representative figure in this general movement. We're thinking culture more as a natural thing, a natural production. Whereas traditionally culture was more seen as, a kind of within the framework of religious humanism. That, culture was somehow a thing that had come down from, in a religious sense, that it was religiously inspired. So these were naturalist approaches to the whole concept of culture. It's just everybody has it. And even thinking of it as different levels, they all function for the people who are part of them. Also, Tyler rejected polygynist arguments of the day. Polygynist arguments were that the human races had all been created separately, that they were different from each other. He held and argued for a monogynist, which argued that all races were simply branches of the same, just branches of Homo sapien, and that as far as having different origins, out of the question. And also he rejected the notion of cultural degeneration. The sense that, some people had high cultures at one time, and then they kind of degenerated into, into lower existences, lower. I mean, his arguments were that all cultures, at the level that they exist, are functioning effectively for the people who are part of them. So a much more naturalized approach to the human context. So Darwin was part of a whole series. His Descent of Man was part of a whole sort of series of discoveries and new fields that had emerged in his time, and he was familiar with all these. He was widely read. So okay, so. We're just looking at Descent of Man, but there is this other section of the book, huge, which is Selection in Relation to Sex. But it's organized basically into 7 chapters, and these chapters look at various phases. The first chapter is really works sort of on a physical basis, looking at a number of aspects of that humans have in common with other forms of other mammals. And then he goes through a number of different types of comparative sections. I only had you read a few sections here, just snippets. So, and the discussion on race is definitely at the end. But I think it is interesting to sort of just go back to how he starts with this, because it's very characteristic of his thinking, the way he starts out. He says at the first page of part 1, he says, "He who wishes to decide whether man is the modified descendant of some pre-existing form would probably first inquire whether man varies, however slightly, in bodily structure and in mental faculties. So he's looking for that variation. Does variation actually take place in humans? And that's the pattern he used in his origin. Is there this thing, are these forms varying? And if so, whether the variations are transmitted to his offspring in accordance with the laws which prevail with the lower animals. So this is why he's so interested in structure, bone structure, and rudiments. Rudiments are a very important part of his argument because he can use these rudiments to sort of argue these things are being inherited generation after generation, yet their functions are, they have no function.
Yeah, we went on about the ear thing for a long time.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out if I had it. It's inside, like on the little picture?
It's some little ridge, yeah.
Huh. And he thinks like before it poked out more?
He gets into a whole series of kind of
Oh, yeah.
little
He's going on about the ear.
he's definitely. But as he builds up this argument, you realize, there's a substantial amount of material there. I mean, he's really looked at these. Devin.
One thing on that ear argument, while I agree it went on for a bit, it was a fascinating and one of the best examples I've ever seen of the interplay between art and science.
Mm-hmm.
Because he starts that section with the celebrated sculptor informs me of a little peculiarity of the external ear. So this guy was there trying to sculpt a picture of what was Puck, which I assume was Midsummer Night's Dream. Yeah. And he was looking at, how do I make the shape of the ear so pointed? And when he went to look at drawings, he started noticing that there were actually points. And suddenly, an effort of self-expression suddenly turns into a scientific endeavor. And I just thought that was a wonderful kind of C.P. Snow-like, two cultures sort of thing. So.
Yeah. Well, Darwin, and it's also a wonderful example of Darwin's kind of omnivorous interest. Yeah. He reads everything, and he's an encyclopedia of reference, and he pulls all sorts of things from letters that people have written him, articles, books. It's amazing how extensive his knowledge he's accumulated. All right, and then he asks the next paragraph in the opening is the inquirer would next come to the important point whether man tends to increase at so rapid a rate as to lead to occasional severe struggles for existence, and consequently to beneficial variations, whether in body or mind, being preserved and injurious ones eliminated. And and these two questions he answers in the affirmative, that there's massive evidence for both. And so he kind of sets up his book in the same framework that of thinking that he set up the origin of species. Okay. So then in chapter 1, as David suggested and referred to, there are different classes of fact, including bodily structure, similar bodily structure between humans and their relative mammals, bone structure, the internal structure, and the second big area that he explores is embryonic development. He looks at these embryos, and he has the photograph of the human embryo and the canine, the dog embryo. Darwin actually was very fond of dogs, but some people would see that as an unflattering comparison. But again, it's a pretty convincing comparison. You can see the similarities in these forms, and then rudiments, as we said. All these. I mean, he gets into the os coccyx too. He's just really interested in that tailbone. And the fact that it shows sort of rudiments of a actual tail, and that the best way to understand that is, it's no longer a functioning part of human anatomy, but that at some ancestral stage, an ancestor's other species, no doubt, possessed it. So there are a lot of different details, and this tends to be this is the core of his argument. He also makes arguments about diseases. What are his arguments there? Chris?
That man can also man can get diseases from animals.
Yeah. Okay. And why is that? How does that?
It reflects that they have the same immune systems or the same architecture.
Yeah. Yeah, they sort of pass through. So they're, again, this suggests a set of common traits and characteristics that argues for some kind of common origin.
One important point I thought you brought up there is you could make the argument that if there's a creator and he created all of these different organisms, including the diseases, if you just assume there would be living things, and the monkeys and man, that he just hardwired it for all of them to get sick. Like, that on its own isn't a good enough explanation. But what does kind of turn the tides is that it says in his work that the medicines that we make for ourselves also work on these same animals. So here's something that obviously wasn't made by the creator. And at this point, if you want to stick with the creator metaphor, you have to stretch the argument. You have to say, well, he made the mind of man able to make medicine that was hardwired to work not just for man, but for all of these other things. And you realize that the story starts getting more and more stretched.
It's harder and harder
right,
to maintain.
so.
Yeah. Very good point. Excellent. And then also he argues, I think in sections that I didn't ask you to read, but he argues that the mental powers are, in many cases, very similar. They're a whole set of emotions, set of an ability to interact with the environment through perception and through certain types of judgment that really indicate that human capacity is an extension and an advance in some ways and a weakening in other ways of the same types of powers that exist in other organisms, specifically other mammals. So we can see here a kind of an emergence of a naturalistic view of humans as being basically, another species. Okay, so Darwin really does explore the question of race in some at some length, and most of his discussion tries to capture the similarities in race and to point out that these so-called races could not possibly be different species. Why? What are some of the reasons for this? Well, you remember he went on his great voyages and he went to these great cities. And what did he find in these cities? In South America, various other humans interbred freely. I mean, this was not a uncommon thing. It was uncommon in England, but as he traveled the world, he saw people, all kinds of racial mixtures, and it was just highly unlikely that if these different races could intermarry and in Darwin's sense interbreed and produce offspring, that they basically were they were functioning as a common species.
Yeah, he said, like, even a slight degree of sterility between any two forms when first crossed is a decisive test in their specific distinctness. So if we can't have the ability, like, regardless of how different cultures are and all that, if we have the ability to crossbreed, then we're the same species.
Yeah, so he came to the conclusion that most racial characteristics are from sexual selection. What is he getting at there? That racial characteristics would be primarily through sexual selection. Okay, so so sexual selection, mainly a secondary selection process, not as powerful, but in the expression of these characteristics through sexual selection are ones that in some ways are weaker forms of selection. They persist, but they can very easily sort of revert back to something else or get changed to something else, and so it's not as powerful a form of selection as natural selection. But basically, sexual selection just simply works through the process of people selecting each other as mates. And through this process, Darwin argues, the phenomena that we call race emerged. But just like these dogs, almost all of them interbreed, if they're at least at the right size and so forth. And if you don't maintain them, or if they drift off and breed with other species not similar to them, they will revert back into or change to combinations and ultimately lose their specific breed characteristics. So the same with humans. If they intermarry and through the generations continue to intermarry across these racial groupings, they basically become combinations, blends of things. And so many of the secondary sexual characteristics that are expressed in what we call the phenotype today disappear or get changed or blended. All right, so basically this view is not a common view in Darwin's day. And it's one of the things that I've always, Darwin had kind of biases and elements, and sometimes you want to say, this seems, but at the end of the day, Darwin really made a very powerful argument that that rejected the kind of racist view that these different peoples are different species and should not be allowed to intermix, and they were, I think Darwin is a very powerful force against that kind of argument. So as a person of his day, we should at least respect the fact that he gave very strong scientific backing for the concept that humans as races are basically just variations of the same species. Okay. So people always ask, what's a social Darwinist? He says a lot of things that make you wonder. Like, if the various checks specified in the last two paragraphs, and perhaps others as yet known, this is in chapter 4, do not prevent the reckless, the vicious, and otherwise inferior members of society from increasing at a quicker rate than the better class of men, the nation will retrograde, as has too often occurred in the history of the world. We must remember that progress is no invariable rule. What's he saying here? Jake?
He's saying that you want your better members of society to reproduce faster, more prolifically than
Yeah.
less helpful
Okay.
members.
So this is a way of thinking that emerged that was ultimately called social Darwinism. Does anybody have any concepts of what social Darwinism is about? It's a big cluster of ideas. We're going to explore it later in a couple of our classes. But the argument here is that, kind of people who are not very thoughtful breed very fast, and they're going to outpopulate the intellectuals and the better class of people, and eventually they will kind of overwhelm the society with low class. So this was something that Darwin's this type of argument is certainly a fear in the back of Darwin's mind that inferior people can breed faster, and it is what it is. It's not what we would consider a socially. I mean, first of all, it's not true because there are many people. I mean, breeding rates have to do with lots and lots of things, but not with factors of poverty and lack of intelligence.
And for Darwin's kind of like adherence to this notion of flux and change, he seems to treat the notions of superior and inferior members of society as a rather static thing, which is it's like kind of contrary, to it's like. Just take a little bit of what you've been doing and just, So.
And a lot of people, Huxley later said, he was a colleague of Darwin's, but he said, if we are going to select people on the basis of poverty and wealth as being, as meriting survival, there are a lot of us who would be selected out. In other words, perfectly brilliant people emerge from the most humble circumstances. And the idea that, because you're born in poverty or you come from a family that of poor means, the idea that that's a reflection on the merits and of your existence and is really wrong, because lots and lots of talent emerges.
I think that Huxley calls him out on that too, because Huxley was mostly self-taught and had very little schooling.
Absolutely,
and was kind of,
absolutely. Huxley came from a family that would definitely have merited suppression, maybe not extirpation, but not encouragement. He says all ought to refrain from marriage who cannot avoid abject poverty for their children. Well, there's some good advice there. Shouldn't get married if you can't take care of your kids. But he then goes on, he says, for poverty is not only a great evil, but tends to its own increase by leading to recklessness in marriage. I'm not sure that bears, that there's much evidence for that.
Statistically, he's right. That people who do not go to college tend to marry considerably younger and then proliferate earlier on in their life before they can establish themselves in society.
Okay. All right. Well,
is that what recklessness means?
I'm not sure. It's kind of, it is true that people who go to college have to defer, but in Darwin's day, very few people went to college. It's just a little tiny fraction of extremely wealthy people. But there are some legitimate questions in here. I wouldn't reject that. It's just Darwin. It's not what Darwin spends his time studying. Here he's just kind of putting these in as just as kind of common sense things, but they're not really based on a scientific sampling and whole. But that said, these are all questions that are worth considering and studying and trying to understand. Okay, well, not sure we... I put this in. I'm not going to say anything about Wallace, but I just want to bring him back in here. Wallace was a really, really important thinker. And he he developed his Sarawak law, and he was a specialist in biodistribution, geological distribution of species. Allopatric speciation, that's the type of speciation that takes place from geographic separation, like Darwin's finches. And he did an incredible amount of work, and he wrote wonderful works on geological distribution. He also argued later in life that humans had developed, we'll have to finish here, humans had developed the capacity to think at such a level that it sort of stepped out of the gradualism of the Darwinian model. He could not, Wallace felt that there was some kind of intervention at some point that gave rise to human consciousness and the ability to think and to create culture and everything, because he could not find an organism, a species, a primate that was even close to what humans were. So he just thought the jump was so vast it could not be explained through natural gradual processes. And so he kind of developed a view that humans were an exception. That somehow, at some point, some intervention. He never explained quite what who did it, or how it happened, or what the physical force that caused it was. But he did have this view, and Darwin was really, really upset with Wallace over some of his thinking about human exceptionalism. But Wallace was a thinker on his own right, and he had. Okay, so we don't have time to do a whole lot here. I gave you these slides. There's a lot. I just want to point out this one thing, that there's a lot known today about human migration patterns, and a lot of this has been traced and studied scientifically, and we have a much better understanding of how all this worked. And then I've got some things on early tool development. And then I always have to end with this chart, because we are in a dilemma. Since the old Stone Age, you can see what's happening with human population. And, somebody's got to, people have to deal with this, and I don't think people are dealing with it. You've said a few times. They're kind of just wishing it away. And this is a powerful problem for us. And Darwinian framework allows us to think deliberately about what these conditions are. What can we do about them? There just aren't enough people doing anything about this. And it's most unfortunate. There are people, this is somebody who's, on the far end of it, but he says, Fenner, professor of microbiology, that humans will not be able to survive the population explosion and unbridled consumption, and will become extinct perhaps within a century. Well, that's a little soon, but the point as well is made that we are on a really bad track, and that somehow we have to get a hold of it. And I think we have the technological capabilities, but it's something on the political side, or we have a lot of, it comes back to the culture. Our culture may well be a set of blinders for us too.